The Pacific Ocean does not care about you. At dawn on June 4, 1942, the surface temperature of the water surrounding Midway Atoll sat at 79 degrees Fahrenheit. The air temperature at flight deck level, where men were working at full speed, had already reached 83 degrees by 0430 hours.
The sky was clear. The wind was light, running northeast at 14 knots. Good carrier weather. The kind of morning that Japanese naval planners had been counting on.
Below the horizon, 250 miles to the northwest, 4 fleet carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Kido Butai, the mobile strike force, were running at 24 knots into that light wind, preparing to launch the aircraft that would neutralize Midway's airfield and prepare the way for the invasion that Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku had spent months assembling.
The ocean looked exactly the same as it always had. It offered no sign of what was about to happen to the people moving across its surface. Inside the hangar decks of the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, the conditions were already precise, not peaceful.
The hangar deck of a Nagumo-class fleet carrier measured approximately 700 feet in length by 75 feet in width, roughly the footprint of a city block, enclosed by steel walls below a steel ceiling, with the flight deck as the roof and the ocean as the floor.
Inside that space, on each of the 4 carriers, ground crews were completing the final arming and fueling of aircraft that had been in various states of preparation since midnight. Torpedo bombers with fully loaded Type 91 aerial torpedoes.
Dive bombers with 250-kilogram bombs. Zero fighters with full ammunition loads. All of them were fueled with aviation gasoline from lines that ran through the hangar deck like a nervous system, connected to tanks that held thousands of gallons of fuel in spaces that had no exit to the open air except through the narrow elevator shafts that connected the hangar to the flight deck. There were approximately 1,500 men on each carrier. Most of them were below the flight deck. This is not a story about victory or defeat in the abstract. It is a story about what happens to human bodies inside an enclosed steel environment when the conditions inside that environment transition in a matter of seconds from controlled chaos to catastrophic fire. It is a story about the physical reality of what naval aviation historians call fatal vulnerability, the technical term for the state that the Kido Butai's 4 carriers had been in, without knowing it, since the moment they began rearming their aircraft below decks at 07:15 that morning. It is a story about 300 seconds. But before those 300 seconds, there were hours. Understanding those hours is the only way to understand why the 300 seconds happened the way they did. The Kido Butai launched its first strike against Midway at 0430, sending 108 aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters, toward the atoll, in a formation that pilots described in after-action reports as filling the sky. The strike was competent. It damaged Midway's facilities and destroyed several aircraft on the ground. But the commander of the strike wave, Lieutenant Commander Tomonaga Joichi, radioed back at 0700 with an assessment that would initiate the chain of decisions that killed 3 carriers.
His message read, "There is need for a second attack wave." This message arrived on the Akagi's bridge at the exact moment the Japanese carriers began to receive reports of American aircraft attacking from Midway.
None of the attacks were successful, a fact that is crucial to understanding the disaster that followed. But the attacks were constant. Between 0705 and 0930, 6 separate waves of American aircraft attacked the Kido Butai. TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses at high altitude, Vindicator dive bombers, TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from the American carriers, wave after wave. None of them hit. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the Zeros flying protective cover above the fleet, shot them down in large numbers. Of the 41 Devastators that attacked in 3 separate torpedo squadron assaults, 35 were shot down before reaching the release point. The survivors flew back to their carriers, most of them too damaged to fight again. But they had done something without meaning to. Every failed attack forced the Kido Butai to maneuver.
Carriers turning hard to unmask their anti-aircraft guns. Zeros from the combat air patrol descending to low altitude to engage the torpedo bombers, which flew their attack runs at 150 feet above the water. The combat air patrol, responding to threat after threat at low altitude, was burning fuel, expending ammunition, and critically, flying at low altitude instead of high altitude, which was where dive bombers attacked from. The men on the Japanese carriers, watching wave after wave of Americans get shot down, had every rational reason to believe the situation was under control.
Rear Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, watching from the Akagi's bridge, saw dozens of American aircraft falling into the sea. He saw not a single bomb hit, not a single torpedo hit. The American attacks were, from his vantage point, being destroyed. He had no way to know that 37 dauntless dive bombers from the carriers Yorktown and Enterprise were approaching from the northeast at 20,000 feet, where no Japanese Zero was waiting for them.
But before we get to those 300 seconds, I need to show you something about the space those 1,500 men were living inside. The decision that sealed the fate of the Kido Butai had been made at 07:15, when Nagumo ordered his aircraft to be rearmed from anti-ship weapons, torpedoes, and armor-piercing bombs designed to attack enemy warships, back to general-purpose bombs for a second strike against Midway.
This decision had been reversed at 07:45, when reports came in that American surface ships, possibly including carriers, had been spotted to the northeast. The rearming began again in the opposite direction. Aircraft that had just been converted from anti-ship to land attack were now being converted back to anti-ship configuration. This required removing torpedoes that had been stowed, removing bombs that had been loaded, and replacing them with the correct weapons for attacking armored warships. The standard procedure for this process required returning removed weapons to the armory magazines, the reinforced compartments deep in the ship specifically designed to store live ordnance safely. But the rearming had been going on since 07:15, and the first strike aircraft were scheduled to launch by 10:30. There was not enough time to return everything to the magazines and complete the rearming before launch. So the crew chiefs and ordnance handlers did what people do when they are under operational pressure and the clock is running. They stacked the weapons they had removed on the hangar deck floor. Bombs, torpedoes, live ordnance, not in magazines, sitting on the steel deck of an enclosed space that was also fueled aircraft. This is what fatal vulnerability actually means in physical terms, not an abstract tactical error, not a failure of doctrine or training. It means that by 0930 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the hangar decks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu contained fueled aircraft with armed ordnance under their wings, and separate piles of additional live ordnance stacked on the deck around them, and fuel lines running through the entire space, all inside a steel box with limited exits. The ocean, 30 feet below the keel, was still 79 degrees. At 10:22 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey of Enterprise, leading his 2 dive bomber squadrons in a search pattern after having flown past the expected position of the Japanese fleet, spotted the wake of the Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, racing at full speed to rejoin the fleet after having depth-charged an American submarine. McCluskey turned to follow the destroyer's wake. His aircraft had been airborne for nearly 3 hours. Their fuel levels were critical, but the wake led him directly to the Kido Butai, arriving overhead at 10:22, with the combat air patrol fully engaged below at low altitude, intercepting the last wave of Devastator torpedo bombers. What the dauntless pilots saw from 20,000 feet was a formation of 4 large carriers, their flight decks active with aircraft in various stages of preparation for launch, their wakes cutting white lines against the dark blue of the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Dick Best, leading VS-6 from Enterprise, estimated later that from altitude the carriers looked almost peaceful. 37 dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives at 10:22 a.m. The dive bombing attack in 1942 was a precise art, with terrifying physical characteristics for both the attacker and the target. The Dauntless entered its dive at approximately 70 degrees, nearly vertical, from 20,000 feet, accelerating to between 250 and 280 knots in the dive. The G-forces during pullout compressed the pilot into a seat with 3 to 4 times his body weight, graying his vision. The entire sequence from pushover to bomb release to pullout
took approximately 45 seconds. During those 45 seconds, the pilot was committed. There was no abort, no correction, no second chance.
The bomb went where the dive went. The men on the Akagi's flight deck, preparing aircraft for the strike that was scheduled to launch in approximately 8 minutes, had approximately 4 seconds of warning before the first bomb hit.
The dive bombers came down at nearly vertical angles out of a clear blue sky, against a combat air patrol that was fully occupied at low altitude, against anti-aircraft gunners who were tracking low-level torpedo planes. The Dauntlesses arrived at the one moment and from the one direction where the Japanese defenses had created an irreversible gap. Near miss, hit. The first bomb to hit the Akagi struck her flight deck amidships, penetrating to the upper hangar deck before detonating. The second hit near the aft elevator, penetrating to the lower hangar deck. 2 bombs.
That was all. Of the 26 Dauntlesses assigned to attack the Akagi, most missed. But 2 hits into a hangar deck that contained fueled aircraft, stacked live ordnance, and fuel lines running through the entire space did not need to be followed by a third.
The detonation of the bombs ignited the aviation gasoline in the fueled aircraft on the hangar deck. The ignited gasoline then ignited the fuel lines. The ignited fuel lines reached the ordnance that had been stacked on the deck rather than returned to the magazines.
Within seconds of the bomb hits, the Akagi's hangar deck was experiencing sequential detonations. Not a single explosion, but a chain, each detonation feeding the next. The temperature inside the enclosed steel space reaching levels that the ship's designers had never contemplated, because no one had designed a warship to survive the detonation of its own ordnance from inside. Admiral Nagumo had to be physically carried off the bridge, not because he was injured, but because the bridge was on fire and the people around him had to force him to leave. On the Kaga, attacking aircraft from Enterprise achieved 3 to 4 hits in approximately the same time window. Same hangar deck conditions, same stacked ordnance, same fuel lines. The chain reaction on the Kaga was, if anything, faster than on the Akagi. Survivors' accounts collected by historian Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully for their definitive study, Shattered Sword, describe the Kaga's hangar deck as appearing to detonate almost simultaneously along its entire length, as though the ship had been filled with explosive charges rather than aircraft.
On the Soryu, attacking aircraft from the Yorktown, 17 Dauntlesses under Commander Maxwell Leslie achieved 3 hits in quick succession. The Soryu's executive officer later reported that after the third hit, the ship seemed to leap from the water and then settle back before the fires became uncontrollable. From 10:22 to 10:27, 5 minutes, 3 carriers. I want you to stay with that physical reality for a moment, because the speed of it is part of what needs to be understood. The men on the Akagi's hangar deck, the ordnance handlers who had been working since midnight, the fuel crew, the aircraft mechanics making final adjustments, had at most 30 seconds between the sound of anti-aircraft fire picking up above them and the moment the first bomb penetrated the flight deck. 30 seconds is not enough time to reach an exit from a space 700 feet long. It is not enough time to do anything except understand, in a purely bodily sense, that the conditions around you have changed in a way that is beyond your control. The men who survived were overwhelmingly the men who were on the flight deck at the moment of impact, in the open air, with the ocean visible, with the possibility of going over the side. The men who were below, inside the hangar deck or deeper in the ship's machinery spaces, faced a different physical reality. The chain reaction fires in the hangar consumed oxygen. The steel walls conducted heat. The passageways that connected internal spaces to exits became within minutes impassable, not blocked by structural collapse, but by temperature, by smoke so dense and hot that breathing was physiologically impossible. The Japanese Navy's damage control teams were not untrained. They were, by any objective measure, among the best drilled naval personnel in the world in 1942. But damage control procedures assume that you are fighting a fire, that there is a fire in one location which can be isolated, starved of oxygen, flooded with water or foam. The chain reaction inside the Akagi's, Kaga's, and Soryu's hangar decks was not a fire in any conventional sense. It was the simultaneous ignition of everything flammable inside an enclosed space, sequentially detonating its own stored ordnance, feeding itself on aviation gasoline from ruptured fuel lines, in a space where the temperature was rising faster than any pumping system could address. The damage control teams went in anyway. Multiple accounts from survivors describe officers and enlisted men entering the hangar decks after the initial explosions, trying to reach fire mains, trying to isolate fuel lines, trying to flood ordnance that was already cooking off in the heat. Most of them did not come back out. By 11, approximately 35 minutes after the initial hits, all three carriers were considered beyond saving. The Soryu sank at 1913 that evening, taking Commander Yanagimoto Ryusaku, her captain, with her. He refused evacuation, remaining at his post on the bridge. The Kaga sank at 1925 after her torpedo storage detonated and blew out her bottom. The Akagi, her fires burning for hours but her structural integrity initially holding, was finally scuttled by Japanese destroyer torpedoes at 0500 the following morning, June 5th, because the fleet could not afford to let her fall into American hands. But the fourth carrier, Hiryu, had escaped the attack, and Hiryu was not done. Vice Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon, commanding from Hiryu, launched his counterattack at 10:58, even as the other three carriers were burning. 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zeros, then 12 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 more Zeros. They found the Yorktown, and they hurt her badly enough that she was abandoned by her crew before being finished off by a Japanese submarine 2 days later. Yamaguchi's counterattack demonstrated exactly what the Kido Butai had been capable of that morning: fast, coordinated, lethal. But Hiryu had 42 aircraft, not the 200 that the full Kido Butai had carried. At 1700, 24 Dauntlesses from Enterprise found Hiryu in the same state her sister ships had been in at 1022. Flight deck active, aircraft being prepared for another strike, combat air patrol depleted and overwhelmed. 4 hits. Same chain reaction. Hiryu joined her sisters in the inventory of burning ships that the Pacific was accumulating. Yamaguchi refused to abandon ship. He reportedly drank a ceremonial cup of sake with his captain, Kaku Tomeo, and remained on the bridge as Hiryu burned through the night and sank before dawn on June 5th. The final accounting is recorded in the after-action reports that both navies filed in the weeks following the battle. The United States lost the Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond, plus 147 aircraft and 307 men. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, plus the heavy cruiser Makuma, 248 aircraft and 3,057 men. The aircrew losses were particularly devastating. Among the dead were many of the veteran aviators who had conducted the Pearl Harbor attack, the strike on Ceylon, and the operations across Southeast Asia. These men had between 2 and 5 years of carrier aviation experience. They could not be replaced on the same timeline that shipyards could replace ships. But the numbers, accurate as they are, do not quite capture what happened. Let me show you why. The Imperial Japanese Navy went into the Battle of Midway with 10 fleet and light carriers in its order of battle. After Midway, it had 6, and of those 6, only 2 were available for immediate operations because the others were in various stages of construction or repair. The United States had 3 fleet carriers before Midway. After Midway, it had 2. The Yorktown was gone, and the Enterprise and Hornet had both taken damage. On paper, Japan still had more carrier aviation than the United States, but Japan could not replace what it had lost in the time available. The 4 carriers destroyed at Midway had taken between 3 and 7 years to build and fit out. Their replacement hulls, the Taiho, the Shokaku, and Zuikaku undergoing repairs. The converted hulls of the Junyo and Hyo were months or years from completion. The aircrew problem was more acute. Japanese naval aviation training in 1942 produced perhaps 100 qualified carrier pilots per year. The United States, having recognized the personnel crisis before the war, had established the V-5 Naval Aviation Cadet Program, which would produce more than 60,000 pilots by the war's end. In 1942, American production was already running at approximately 30,000 aircraft per year. Japan was running at approximately 10,000. The scale of this disparity was not something that any individual on either carrier force could observe on the morning of June 4th. The men on the Akagi's hangar deck, preparing aircraft before dawn, could not see the factories in Detroit, Seattle, and Marietta. The dauntless pilots descending through 20,000 feet could not see the training fields in Pensacola and Dallas where their replacements were already learning to fly. What they could see was their immediate environment, the deck they stood on, the aircraft they maintained, the sky they flew through. But the disparity was already there, invisible and decisive, operating at a scale that dwarfed everything happening on the surface of the water. Here's what the randomness of those 300 seconds actually looked like from inside the events. McCluskey's Dauntlesses had been airborne since 0702. Their assigned search sector had not found the Japanese fleet. Standard procedure would have been to turn back at the predetermined turnaround point to conserve fuel for the return to Enterprise.
McCluskey continued searching for an extra half hour beyond the point where Doctrine said to turn back. He spotted the Arashi's wake because it was running at the precise angle and speed to cross his search track at the exact moment his aircraft were overhead.
Lieutenant Commander Dick Best, leading VS-6, saw what he believed was a targeting error developing. The majority of the Dauntlesses appeared to be diving on Kaga rather than Akagi. Best broke his element away from the main group and attacked the Akagi with only 3 aircraft, achieving the 2 hits that started the Akagi's chain reaction. If Best had followed the main group, Kaga might have received more hits and Akagi might have survived. If Best had stayed with Akagi but missed 2 bombs, both of which were required, neither of which was guaranteed, the Akagi might have been operational for a counterstrike. The Soryu's combat air patrol was positioned in a configuration that left a gap at the exact altitude and azimuth from which Commander Leslie's Yorktown squadron attacked. Leslie himself had a malfunction in his bomb release mechanism and dropped his bomb accidentally before reaching the target, arriving over the Soryu with no weapon. He pressed the attack anyway, in a dry run, to serve as a decoy for the pilots behind him. The Hiryu survived the morning because she happened to be positioned at the northern edge of the carrier formation, far enough from the center that when McCluskey's aircraft committed to attacking the 2 carriers nearest to them, Hiryu was beyond the practical attack radius given their fuel states. None of these outcomes were determined by skill or preparation. Skill and preparation were necessary conditions. Without them, the attacks would not have had the capability to succeed, but they were not sufficient conditions. The actual outcomes were determined by the Arashi's heading, by Best's decision to break formation, by the combat air patrol's altitude distribution, and by the Hiryu's position in the formation. These were things not controlled by anyone, not planned by anyone, and not reducible to anyone's competence or failure. Mitsuo Fuchida, the Japanese airman who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and was present on the Akagi during the Battle of Midway, though unable to fly due to injuries, wrote in his memoir, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, that he saw the faces of my men, men who had trained for years, men who had no equal in the world, fall silent as the bombs hit. And I thought, this is not something that was supposed to happen to us. The phrase, not supposed to happen to us, carries significant weight in that sentence. The Japanese carrier force had experienced 26 consecutive months of operational success without a major tactical defeat. They had developed, understandably, an assumption about the relationship between their preparation and their outcomes. Midway did not refute the quality of their preparation. It demonstrated that preparation is not the variable that determines survival. The men who died on the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were, in the main, extraordinarily trained naval professionals doing their jobs correctly. The men who survived were, in many cases, in different physical locations at the moment of impact, through no decision of their own. The hangar deck crew who happened to be at the aft end when the forward bombs hit. The pilot who happened to be in the cockpit of an aircraft, on the flight deck rather, than below waiting for assignment. The officer who happened to have been sent to the bridge with a message at 10:19 rather than remaining in the operations room below. This is not a comfortable fact. It does not fit the narrative that good preparation produces good outcomes, that training determines survival, or that the universe tracks what you do and responds accordingly.
But the physical evidence from the wreck sites, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were located by deep-sea survey teams in 2019 and 2022, lying in water between 17,000 and 18,000 feet deep. Their structural damage, precisely as the survivors' accounts described it, does not support comfortable narratives. It supports what actually happened.
What happened was that 3 carriers, whose crews did everything correctly within the limits of what they could control, were destroyed in 5 minutes by a combination of tactical opportunity and chance alignment of factors that no one on either side had planned for or could have predicted. The moral compromises of those hours were smaller than those of other wars and other battles, but they were present. On the American side, the decision to send the Devastator torpedo squadrons into combat, knowing their aircraft were obsolescent and their attack profiles extremely vulnerable, was made in full understanding that the crews had limited survivability.
It was made anyway, because the tactical situation required it. 35 of 41 Devastators were shot down. Their crews had been told the odds. They went anyway.
The moral weight of the decision to send them, made by officers who would survive the day, is not resolved by the fact that the Devastator attacks drew the Japanese combat air patrol to low altitude and contributed to the conditions that allowed McCluskey's dive bombers to arrive unopposed.
It is simply a weight that the decision-makers carried in silence afterward.
On the Japanese side, the decision to stack ordnance on the hangar deck rather than return it to the magazines was made by multiple crew chiefs and ordnance officers under time pressure, following what their training and experience told them was the necessary course of action to meet the launch schedule. It was a reasonable decision under the circumstances. It created the conditions that killed their shipmates. The survivors of that decision, the ones who lived, carried the knowledge of it for decades. Not because they made the wrong choice by the standards available to them at the time, but because the choice had consequences that no standard of time-pressure decision-making could redeem. The 4 carriers settled into the Pacific at depths that placed them beyond any salvage, beyond any recovery, beyond any resolution. The 3,057 Japanese naval personnel who died at Midway are still in the hulls. Some of the wreck photography conducted during the 2019 and 2022 survey operations showed personal effects on the hangar decks, boots, equipment, items that had belonged to men who had been in those spaces on the morning of June 4th and had not left. Hiroshi Suzuki, a damage control officer on the Akagi, who survived by going over the side as the fire spread, gave a series of interviews to Japanese journalists in the 1980s that were later compiled into a short memoir. He described the particular quality of the silence after he entered the water, after the roar of the fires and the detonations and the machinery and the screaming. He said the Pacific Ocean was warm. That was the word he used, warm. He had expected it to be cold. It was warm. Suzuki was rescued after approximately 3 hours in the water and was taken aboard a Japanese destroyer. He spent the remainder of the war in land-based assignments. He returned to the Merchant Marine after 1945. He died in 1987. He told the journalist who collected his memoir that he had thought about the warmth of the water almost every day for 45 years. Not about the bombs, not about the fires, not about the men he could not reach, about the warmth of the water. This is the particular quality of what the sensory hellscape leaves behind, not the dramatic moments, which the mind can eventually process, file, and contextualize, but the small, specific physical details that the nervous system logged before the conscious mind could intercede. The warmth of the water, the smell of aviation fuel before ignition, the vibration through the deck plates at a particular frequency that meant something had changed below, and you did not yet know what. These details do not go away. They are not processed. They live in the body's threat recognition system permanently, associated with the moment of maximum danger, re-triggered by the corresponding sensory input for the rest of the person's life. The smell of aviation fuel, the distinct pitch of a high-performance engine at high RPM, the quality of light on open water in early morning. For the men who survived the Kido Butai's destruction, these sensory details were permanently recorded, from neutral to threatening, from the unremarkable background of their working lives to the sensory signatures of catastrophe.
Nagumo Chuichi, carried off the Akagi's bridge and transferred to the light cruiser Nagata, remained in command of the surviving force for the remainder of the battle. He was relieved of further carrier commands afterward. He was given shore and island defense assignments. In July 1944, while commanding the defense of Saipan, he died by suicide as American forces overran the island's defenses. He was 57 years old. His official death report lists death in battle. The nature of his death was documented in post-war American intelligence files.
Yamaguchi Tamon, the commander who launched Hiryu's counterattack and who refused evacuation when Hiryu was destroyed, was 49 years old at his death. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis as an exchange student in 1921. He spoke English. He had friends in the American Navy. He went down with his ship in the early hours of June 5, 1942, in water that was 79 degrees.
The thing that happened at Midway, the specific, physical, documented thing, was that a set of conditions which had been building for hours reached a threshold at 10:22 a.m. and resolved in 5 minutes.
The 4 carriers had been built over 7 years. The aircrew had trained for 2 to 5 years. The operational planning had taken 6 months. The rearming decisions had been made over a 4-hour window.
And then, between 10:22 and 10:27, in the time it takes to boil a kettle of water, the entire accumulated investment of years, months, and hours converted into fire.
The strategic consequence, the transfer of Pacific naval dominance from Japan to the United States, is measured in years and thousands of miles. The physical consequence was measured in 5 minutes and the 700-foot interior length of 3 hangar decks. Here is my question for you.
Hiroshi Suzuki thought about the warmth of the water almost every day for 45 years. Not the battle, not the strategy, the water. What does that tell us about what combat actually deposits into the body versus what history records on paper? And what does it cost a person to carry a sensation, not a memory, not a conclusion, but a physical sensation for 4.5 decades? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The questions these men's experiences raise do not have easy answers, and I would genuinely like to know what you think. If this changed how you understand what naval warfare actually felt like from the inside, hit that like button and subscribe. We are going to keep going deeper into the history that the textbooks flatten into dates and outcomes. Thanks for watching.